we began to look at the concept of state monopoly capital by exploring that first chapter of the book, which I since sent to you, the whole book. So if you may recall, in the first session last week, the discussion raised a number of very important questions. In particular, the apparent contradiction between a kind of transnational global imperialist form of capitalism on the one hand, and its state entrenched foundations. So it's a kind of a contradiction between state monopoly capital based upon indigenous states and the global reach of capitalism. So that's one challenging contradiction. And the second point raised by people last week, as I recall, was about how this affects class relations. Is there simply a monolithic two-camp class warfare between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat? Or can we talk about within both the bourgeoisie and the proletariat subclasses and differentiations within those two groups? So, and this affects, of course, how activists and theoreticians and political organisers, this affects how people resist capitalism. So these are important questions. I sent around to you the book and invited you to read the last chapter, because one of the questions which arose last week was, what does all this mean for organisation, for resistance? What's this to do with revolution and socialism? And the last chapter of the book, and I hope you managed to read it, gave an account of resistance to monopoly capitalism in looking at, for example, Spain, Portugal, France, and Chile. And in particular, the last chapter looked at organising united popular fronts against monopoly capital. So they hang on to these notions of popular fronts, their implications, and so on and so forth. And I come back to that for our discussion, but let me just try and remind you some key points about state monopoly capital, some key points. And as I said before, we're not especially talking here about what's sometimes called state monopoly capital or state socialism. I'm not especially talking here about the Soviet Union or indeed China and other socialist societies, or so they claim. I'm talking about state monopoly capitalism within Western democracies, within the global north, within capitalist heartlands. So let's just try to contextualize, let's call it SMC for short, state monopoly capital. Let's just contextualize SMC as some claim to be the latest stage of capitalism, which for many people is a bit surprising and it is disputed. But let's look at these stages. So the first stage was very well described by Marx. He described private capital competing in a market, all the consequences of private competition, crisis, bust and boom, that sort of thing. And as indeed Marx matured and grew older, so did capitalism. And by the end of the 19th century, we could talk about monopoly capital. And of course, Lenin famously capture the essence of monopoly capital in the 1920s in describing the emergence of imperialism and the close connection between monopoly capital, finance capital, and imperialism. And that imperialist capitalist stage, of course, has resulted in what we now call global capitalism on a world stage, of the international, transnational reach of capitalism. And we discussed this sort of capitalism in many contexts and many discussions in the past year or so. What is surprising to many is the re-emergence of a focus on state monopoly capital, which seems to sit uneasily with the notion of global capital. But the 2008 financial crisis and then the COVID crisis has revealed the very direct and close connection between monopoly capital, finance capital, and states, a very important connection, which had been hitherto less apparent. But these two crises illustrated how monopoly capital has become very dependent, totally reliant almost upon state sponsorship. Direct sponsorship by the state for a variety of means. And we discussed these means, and Tom introduced this in his lecture on financialization, but the close connection between the state and monopoly capital, in the sense that the state maintains, sustains, and reproduces monopoly capital. So we can now talk about the unholy trinity, or the triple helix, if you want, of state, monopoly capital, and finance capital. And for some people, for some theoreticians, this is deemed to be another stage of capitalism, another permutation, another variant, a mutation. But like all viruses, it retains its deadly effect. It generates even worse crises than before. The effects are more harmful and long-lasting. So there's been now plenty of work looking at how fiscal monetary policy, quantitative easing, selling of public assets, the bailouts, are all designed to support and revitalize monopoly capitalism at the expense of smaller businesses, of the petty bourgeoisie, and in particular, of course, to the great harm caused to the working classes. One of the direct structural consequences of state monopoly capitalism and its support of monopoly capital are deep structural socio-economic consequences, such as increasing unemployment, precarious work, stagnating wages, falling economic growth, and massive profits for a very small number of people for monopoly capitalists. So there's growing inequality of wealth, increasing poverty within countries and across the world. These are all structural consequences of state monopoly capitalism. And this feature, of course, is in one sense, echo marks its own downfall. It's becoming increasingly difficult for state monopoly capital to justify itself. As the COVID pandemic has exposed the impact on poorer people, on different communities, the impact of state monopoly capital is profound. and importantly, this is beginning to raise class consciousness. So this is one of the contradictions of state monopoly capital. Like all capital contradictions, it generates its own demise in one sense. It increasingly is forced to try to wrest its declining ideological credibility. It is forced increasingly to use authoritarian state policy and indeed state violence to control and repress opposition. Yet, of course, this also raises class consciousness. So, in one sense, in classic Marxist fashion, it is suggested that state monopoly capital is its own grave digger. So we can discuss this later. So these culture wars, the arguments for and against, it has shown, increasingly shown, that state monopoly capital does not work for people. And it's always been claimed, of course, that it does work for people. This is a straightforward contradiction through people's life experiences. No one knows, no one believes anymore, surely, that state monopoly capital is good for the population. That used to be the case. Some people thought it was good, but that's no longer true. The arguments are being lost. And once the arguments are lost, of course, capitalism reverts to violence and oppression, repression of freedom of speech, all those kind of things, the repression of the right to assemble. We are seeing, as we speak tonight, we are seeing all across the country and all around the world, the right of assembly and free speech has been brutally suppressed by states on behalf of state monopoly capital. So now, behind these phenomena, I just want to draw attention to two very important features of state monopoly capital, which have been picked up by Marxist theorists. There are very many aspects, but I'm picking up two, which is, in one sense, highlighted in the book in various ways. The first feature, which contains its own contradiction, is that state monopoly capital generates profits through increasingly socialized relations of production. In other words, the source of profit, state monopoly capital, is increasingly linked to an ever sophisticated social set of arrangements, which begins to rely upon a highly fragmented class structure. There's no longer simply a monolithic bourgeoisie and proletariat, two warring camps, as in Marx's day. Instead, we have subclasses and murky crossover areas. We have managerial and technological functionaries, professional classes, and you may recall probably that over a year ago, we discussed Piketty's notion of a priming class. You may recall that the priming class are new functionaries who run the state. They're the subalterns for state monopoly capitalism. They run the state on behalf of state monopoly capital. And so we're getting this increasingly differentiated class structure. So we can talk about monopoly capitalists and their managers, the people who run these companies. We can talk about non-monopoly capitalists. We can talk about medium and small-sized businesses, and we can talk about the petty bourgeoisie. And then on the other side, of course, the proletariat is itself subdivided into the core workers who help run the system. Then we have the precarious workers, and then we have the unemployed. And amongst all those, there are different subcategories. So what SMC has generated through state activity is a very complex set of class relations. And one of the issues for Marxists is how to seek alliances with some of those subdivisions. Which way will they go? Which way will the petty bourgeois go? Will they come over to the socialist side, the worker side, or will they align themselves with the monopoly capitalists? So there's a tussle going on about how to attract these fragmented classes. A very important struggle. It can be seen, for example, in the rise of Hitler and fascism, which was an alliance between the fascist party and monopoly capital. The very first state monopoly capitalist society was Nazi Germany, and close links between the states, political organs, and monopoly capital. And of course, it attracted the petty bourgeoisie, which was the background, the backbone of fascism. Most workers were against fascism initially. Their failure to confront fascism is another story about the conflict between the Communist Party of Germany and the Social Democratic parties. I mean, that's another discussion. But the point is that state monopoly capitalism generates a complex class structure, and to talk about the bourgeoisie as a monolithic body and the proletariat as a monolithic body is really doesn't reflect reality. They use the concepts at an abstract level, but at a practical level, at a detailed level, the differences are very important. And those differences become the center for resistance and center for strategies in what's called united fronts. The other big contradiction or vulnerability in state monopoly capital, its big vulnerability, of course, is that it's ultra-reliance on the organs of state. It is parasitic on state support, state subsidies, state fiscal policy. From the New Deal onwards, the involvement of the state in subsidizing and financializing and capitalizing monopoly capital is enormous. In other words, the state monopoly capital is utterly dependent for its existence on states. And this, of course, means that it's very vulnerable, because if those that resist monopoly capital can capture state organs through a democratic process or for revolutionary takeovers, if you capture the state, then you can undermine state monopoly capitalists. Very important strategy. Different variations, but if you read that last chapter, you could see how movements in, say, Chile were an attempt to fight against monopoly capitalists through capturing state organs, through popular fronts, through capturing, winning elections, and so on and so forth. So there's a big debate to be had in terms of how those who resist monopoly capital can use the political process to resist. And we can perhaps, we've been discussing the farmers, for example, in India, and I think it's a beautiful example of an alliance, a united front of petty bourgeoisie, small capitalist farmers, and agriculture workers coming together to resist monopoly capital as expressed through Modi and the Indian political system by preventing these laws coming into being. It is a struggle against monopoly capital, and we come back to this sort of resistance later on, because it's maybe it's the way forward. But SMC is vulnerable to attack because the state is its lifeline. it is parasitic on the state. So attacking the superstructure through political democratic activity, through movements, political movements, is a way of undermining state monopoly capitalism. You may disagree, but we can have that debate. So let me conclude by just making some general points. People talk about, or theorists talk about, reform, revolution, transformations. People like Rosa Luxemburg, Kautsky, and so on, Lenin, all debate these things. In Marx's dialectical terms, the question is, how does quantitative activity produce a qualitative change? And you may recall that in one of those videos on dialectics, the example of boiling the water, somehow it becomes different, it acquires a different quality after a certain amount of pressure. As you boil the water and temperature rises, it becomes steam and acquires different characteristics. So one of the debates in tactical and strategic revolutionary activity is how to engineer quantitative changes so that they become a qualitative change. And if you get your strategy wrong, the quantitative changes do not change anything in terms of quality, that's called reformism. If you can convert quantitative changes into a qualitative change, that's called revolution or transformation. So think of this dialectical concept of how does one transfer quantitative change into qualitative change? Is that happening in India with the farmers? Have that debate. Is it happening elsewhere? And so let me finish. If you read through that last chapter, you'd have come across reference to Gramsci. Gramsci talked about the Italian communist. He talked about a war of position, and he likened the struggle against monopoly capital as a kind of trench warfare. You have a long trench warfare along a global front. But the point is to wear down the opposition by constant local attacks, trying to make small little breakthroughs to breach the defences so that you can invade the hinterland of monopoly capital. So if you have this kind of notion of trench warfare, not charging headfirst in front of machine guns, but using tactics and clever manoeuvring, what Gramsci called a war of position, manoeuvring, positioning, to look for the breakthrough, to weaken defences, to grind down the opposition. This seems to be a way forward, which has been advocated in that last chapter. I'll leave it there because I could talk for ages. I hope that's given you some food for thought, and if you combine that with the chapter I sent, we should have a rich discussion. So over to you.